forever and a day. The morning light was just beginning to creep through the basement window. Joe could smell food overhead. He could hear water running and people walking all around the house. He had to wonder why they bothered to wake so early. Surely they didn't have jobs to get to, and he knew that they had been awake all night. Still, they kept up their routine. Joe had tried to sleep after Carl left him, but there was no way for him to get comfortable or to stop his mind from racing in a dozen different directions all at once. The most pressing matter on his mind, of course, was his escape. He needed to figure out a way to break free, and to make sure that he could free Annalise, Leah, and the baby along with him. To do that, he would need to be released from the chains. Even at gunpoint, his odds of escaping were greater if he wasn't chained to a wall. He didn't know what condition Leah would be in when he found her. She had been locked away with these people for well over a year. She had been abused in unthinkable ways. She had been forced to give birth and care for a child in a house full of lunatics. Yet, for the life of him, Joe couldn't figure out why. He spent a good amount of his time pondering that question, wondering if Nazis would keep a woman held captive simply for their own amusement. He didn't doubt that they would, but there was something about Carl that made Joe think that there was more to this situation. He didn't seem like the type of man who would keep a human pet. There must have been something more. Joe's mind went back to Annalise, telling Joe about her sister, how the two of them used to talk to the dead, and how Leah had lost the ability long ago. After that happened, Leah lied about seeing them in order to make people think that she still had the ability. How long could she keep up such an act? How long could she make Carl, Yuta, and Max believe that she could see and hear things that she really couldn't? With luck, they were dumb enough to buy that act for a long time, because Annalise couldn't speak to the dead any longer either. If she were to stay alive, she would have to convince them that she could. Then, of course, there was the question of why they needed someone who could speak to ghosts. Obviously, there were ghosts in the house. They were spirits that Harvey didn't seem to get along with. They were angry, dark spirits who gave Joe the creeps just thinking about them. As Joe thought about those unpleasant ghosts, he began to feel as though he wasn't alone in the basement. It wasn't an emotion, really, but the feeling that there were eyes on him. It was as though someone, or something, were hiding in a corner of the basement. Something not quite human. He'd forgotten about his companion over the course of the night. He'd only felt the presence when he was drugged, and then he assumed that he was feeling the emotions of someone in the house through the haze of those drugs. Now that haze still lingered, but it wasn't the drugs. Focusing on his companion, Joe tried to make sense of it. He tried to figure out what it was or what it meant. He remembered feeling something similar as he approached the Door house, only that haze of darkness was coming from the neighboring homes. It was hanging over the emotions of the people who lived in those houses, dulling them. The more Joe focused on this companion, the more he could feel it dulling his own emotions. It made him feel disconnected from the world around him. It made him feel like something was wrong with him. It made him feel broken, hopeless, hollow. Joe pulled his mind away from his companion and forced himself to push aside all of those feelings that it was giving out. He moved his eyes across the basement, as though he expected to find someone there with him, even though he knew he was alone. He felt a hint of amusement just as the overhead light began to sway for no apparent reason. His eyes locked onto the light and watched it move, as though the light itself were his companion. "Who are you?" he asked, but of course there was no answer. Suddenly, a wave of anger, hatred, amusement, determination, boredom, sadness, hopelessness, and fear struck him at full force, causing him to jump back and shut his eyes. His companion was a ghost. Then, his companion was gone. An hour later, the basement door opened. Joe stood as he waited to see who was coming down the stairs. He had no desire to learn what work Carl had in mind for him, and as he tried to imagine what that might consist of, he began to feel sick. Carl was the first to walk down the stairs, now freshly showered and wearing different clothes than he had been the last time Joe saw him. In the daylight, his face was not struck by the harsh shadows from the overhead light that made him appear more intimidating than he was. Though his features were still sharp and his eyes still contained a darkness in spite of their light color, Joe simply saw Carl as the man he'd broken only hours earlier. Carl could no longer pretend to be calm and even-headed because Joe knew what lurked behind that act. Following Carl into the basement was a much younger man, also appearing to be freshly showered and dressed for a new day's work. Joe assumed that this was Max, though he couldn't remember whether or not he'd ever seen a picture of the boy before. Max had an element of defiance about him. He kept his eyes on Joe, as though he knew that he was the one in control of the situation. He had a gun in his hand, so Joe wasn't going to argue with him on that point, but he got a sense that Max was too comfortable in the role. He wasn't frustrated or angry. He was simply there, doing his job and hoping. What he was hoping for, Joe wasn't really sure. Perhaps he was hoping for the opportunity to kill Joe or torture him for information. Maybe he was hoping for respect. Joe smiled when he saw Max aim the gun at him. Max didn't like that smile at all. He was annoyed when Joe didn't show fear. "No sudden moves," Max said to him. "I won't hesitate to shoot you." "Yes, you will," Joe grinned, refusing to give Max any hint of power over him. "Haven't you heard? I'm the next step in human evolution. I'm very important. Just ask Carl." "I don't care about that. To me, you're just a traitor," Max replied. "A traitor to who?" "To your people." "You're not my people." "Who are?" "Anyone who would put a bullet in Hitler's face is my kind of people." Max raised the gun, obviously eager to pull the trigger and be done with Joe, but Carl smiled and put a hand on Max's gun, pushing it down until it was aimed at the floor. Keeping his eyes on Joe, Carl said, "You do like to stir the pot, don't you?" "There's no radio down here. I have to find some way to stay entertained." "You talk as though you're not scared," Carl told him. "But you're not a policeman or a military man. You sell books. Now you're in a house full of people who could kill you in an instant, and you expect me to believe that you're not nervous. Believe what you want, it's a free country." Max smiled. "Not for long." Joe smiled back. "Forever and a day." The truth was, Joe was nervous. He had no idea what he was going to do or how he was going to do it. He had no idea how to free all of the prisoners being held in that house, making sure to keep them all alive in the process. He had no idea what he was thinking coming to that place without the police. There was a knot in his stomach, so tight he could barely stand without trembling, but he pushed those emotions aside, just as he would push anyone else's. Instead, he focused on the emotions of the men who were standing in front of him, and he chose to feel what they felt. He looked directly into Carl's eyes, and Carl could only see himself reflected back. "We are going to bring you upstairs. I'd like your cooperation," Carl told him. Joe didn't move. He told Carl, "I want to see the others. I want to make sure that they're safe." "The others are fine for now. I make no promises about their future, but it's fair to say that they'll be far better off if you cooperate with us." "What do you want me to do?" "For now, I simply want you to come with us." Joe thought about it for a second or two, before giving Carl a slight nod. He then turned his eyes to Max, who was once again aiming the gun at him. Carl moved to the lock on Joe's shackle and freed his leg. He then gestured for Joe to start walking up the stairs. Joe did as he was ordered. "Try anything funny and you'll get a bullet in you," Max warned. Joe shook his head as he walked and replied, "Your mother sends her love." He smiled as he felt Max's reaction to that comment, throwing off his sense of power over Joe. "You don't know my mother," Max eventually replied, though not as firmly as he probably would have liked. "I know your mother. I know Peter, too. Boy, did he have some things to say about you." A wave of panic ran through Max. The truth was that the information taken from his childhood friend pretty much ended with Carl's name. But Max was worried about something else. Childhood friends usually know all the best secrets about a person. Their most awkward moments, the old wounds that they'd rather forget. Max didn't have to say anything for Joe to know that he was getting under the young man's skin. Now it was a matter of pretending to know more than he did. Joe imagined that this part of his day might actually be fun. As Joe climbed the stairs, Max and Carl followed him. Once he was at the top, he stopped walking and took in his surroundings. It was a nice home, neatly kept, polished furniture. If he didn't know any better, he would have thought that civilized human beings lived there. "Turn right, go into the kitchen," Carl ordered him. Joe considered slamming the door behind him, locking Max and Carl in the basement until they could break free. He wondered if he would have enough time to find Annalise, Leah, and the baby and escape before being shot. He decided against it. Yuta was in the kitchen, cleaning dishes at the sink. Her back was turned to Joe as he entered the room, but she knew he was there. Joe could also feel how upset she was by his presence. Carl gave Joe his next order. "Sit at the table." Joe turned toward the small kitchen table and took a seat. As he did this, Max stood nearby, keeping the gun aimed at Joe's head. Carl went to the stove and prepared a plate of food, while Yuta mumbled to herself and shook her head. When she started scrubbing dishes a little bit more roughly than she had been before, Carl turned to her and said something to her in German with a soft tone. He then turned to Joe and smiled, walking the plate over to the table and setting it down in front of Joe. "If she'd rather I went out for breakfast," Joe quipped. Yuta slammed a plate in the sink. "She doesn't have the same face in you that I have," Carl told Joe, now pouring him a cup of coffee. "And here I just thought she didn't like the dog eating people food at the kitchen table." Carl smiled and nodded and said, "That too. You know, the kid standing too close to me with that gun, I could probably grab it before he knew what was happening." Joe took a sip of coffee. After swallowing, he added, "I could probably aim the gun your way before he managed to squeeze off a shot." "I'd like to see you try it," Max said back. Carl seemed amused by the whole thing. He looked to Max and then back to Joe, before taking a seat at the table. As Joe took a mouthful of food, he looked around the kitchen. He noticed several black candles, half burned, sitting next to the sink. He then noticed a small crystal on the table, with a leather string wrapped around it. The crystal was resting on a folded map with the word Princeton written on it in red ink. He took another bite of food, and then said to Carl, "I don't think the pancakes are cooked all the way through." Yuta slammed another plate in the sink. She then grabbed a knife off of the counter and gripped it tightly in her hand as she washed it. Joe could feel the anger simmering inside of her. She was a baker. She took pride in her food. Carl laughed to himself and shook his head, enjoying the trouble that Joe was causing. Joe was putting on an act as he poked at his captors, testing their emotional responses. Carl was the only one who seemed to realize that he was watching Joe's skill at work. "Where is Annalise?" Joe asked Carl, ignoring Carl's amusement. Max had an emotional reaction to that question. He was defensive. His guard went up. "She's safe, in another room," Carl told Joe. "Perhaps we will let you see her if you cooperate." "Cooperate with what?" "With a project that we've been working on." Yuta shut off the water and stood at the kitchen sink, keeping her back to Joe, Carl, and Max. She stared out the window and listened carefully to what the men were talking about. "I want you to assure me that if I humor you and your project, you'll let me see the others." "Humor? No. But I will assure you that if you cooperate and I feel that you have been as helpful as you can be, I will let you see Annalise." Joe thought about that deal for a moment as he took another bite of his food. He didn't know what would be expected of him, but he decided that it would be in his best interest to play out the scenario and see what happened. He gave Carl a nod, accepting the deal. "Good," Carl smiled. "Now finish your breakfast. You'll need your strength." Joe found himself eating just a little bit slower than before, delaying whatever plans they had for him. He sipped his coffee and pretended that it burned his tongue so that he could buy more time as it cooled. Yuta left the room, never stopping to so much as grimace at Joe. She didn't like what Carl was doing, and Joe kept that fact in his back pocket, just in case it came in handy later. Carl looked down at his watch and then turned his attention back to Joe. He was very patient with Joe as he ate his breakfast, but Joe could tell that time was of the essence. "Do you have an appointment?" Joe asked, in a matter-of-fact tone. If you'd like, I could always go home and come back some other time." "You're an amusing man. But don't worry about the time. We have all day." "Good, good. Say, I don't suppose I could trouble you for some toast." "Finish your breakfast, Mr. Oster," Carl told him, before dropping a smile and taking on a more curious expression. He then asked, "May I call you Joe?" Joe had a mouthful of coffee, so all he could muster at first was a grunt. Once he swallowed, he shook his head and told Carl, "I have a strict policy against Nazis being on a first-name basis with me. Murderers in general, really." Carl was amused, but Max was not. The more Joe joked, the more annoyed Max was becoming. "Tell me, Max, do you enjoy the ballet?" Joe asked, without looking behind him at Max. He remembered the wall of mirrors in the apartment that Max grew up in. Max didn't answer, so Joe continued. "My wife used to love watching the dancers glide across the stage. She admired their dedication to the craft, the discipline they must have had. Personally, I never cared much for it. The ballet always struck me as cold, too disciplined, you know?" Max did not respond, and Joe did not look back to see the expression on his face, but judging by the look that Carl gave him, Joe suspected that Max was responding badly to the topic. "Did your mother make you dance as a child, Max?" Joe asked. Carl pulled a plate of food away from Joe and shook his head. He said, "You're stirring the pot. Do you blame me? You're done with your breakfast. Now we are going into the other room to work, and I want you to know that if I believe you are being anything but honest with me, I will shoot the girl." Joe nodded and drank the rest of his coffee before it could be taken away. Still at gunpoint, Joe was led out of the kitchen toward the living room. Along the way, he passed the basement door and saw a bedroom door just to the side of it. The door was closed, but he could feel Annalise inside of the bedroom. She was awake, but didn't make a sound. In the living room, Joe was taken to one of 3 chairs that were set up around a small table. On the table, he saw an old spirit board used to communicate with the dead during seances. Joe was not a fan of the spirit board, having only attempted to use them once in his life as a child. His mother quickly discovered the board and burned it before grounding Joe for 3 months. He'd never been tempted to use the board again, and he didn't enjoy the idea of being forced to use one now. "Sit," Carl told him. Joe sat in one of the chairs and took in the rest of the room. He could see pieces of paper scattered around the room, with swirls of nonsensical writing on them. He also noticed 2 mirrors which were covered by black cloth, and one which was not. "You're trying to communicate with the ghosts," Joe said to Carl. "Yes, we're a sort of research team." "A research team sent to live in a foreign country. Don't you have dead people over there in Germany?" "We are trying to communicate with some very specific ghosts." "Who?" Carl chose not to answer that question. Instead, he said, "Let's see if you can tell me." "You haven't had much luck so far, judging from the board here and the scribbles. I've seen that mentioned in some of the spooky books we sell down at the store. What's it called again?" "Automatic writing," Carl answered. "And no, we haven't had much luck." "So you kidnap a woman who you think can communicate with the spirits. Only she doesn't, or she can't." Joe could feel a sense of unease rising in Max as he spoke of Leah. Joe continued, "So you get Annalise out here, but she can't communicate with them either." A bit of amusement from Carl. It was a smug, arrogant feeling. "Do we need to go through this?" Max asked Carl, growing more upset as Joe spoke about their plans and actions. "Just make 'em work." "We had the medium working with us, but unfortunately the pressures of the job were more than he could handle." "He's dead?" "Yes. Can't you just send away for another one?" "If only it was that simple. I thought Germany was full of superior humans. Shouldn't you be overwhelmed by psychics and mediums?" "Perhaps someday. Unfortunately, you have mistaken my personal philosophy for a cultural philosophy. There are different schools of thought when it comes to the supernatural." The longer Joe kept Carl talking, the more annoyed Max was getting. He was eager to be done with whatever experiment Carl was planning. Luckily for Joe, Carl seemed to enjoy talking. He told Joe, To find someone who is truly gifted takes time, and our resources have been stretched as of late. We've been forced to make do. I'm flattered. Carl reached into his pocket. When he pulled his hand back out, he was holding onto a plain gold wedding ring. He held it out for Joe. Joe took the ring and looked it over. He noticed some scratches on the ring and a small spot that looked as though it had been melted, but otherwise it looked like a normal wedding band. "What is this?" he asked. "I'd like you to focus on the ring. I'd like to see what you can tell me about it," Carl explained. "I'm not sure that I can do what you want me to do. All I ask is that you try." "And if I fail?" Max was amused by the question. Joe could see Carl's eyes move toward Max and then back to Joe as he said, "Just focus." He held the ring in his hand. He ran his fingers over the scratches, studying them. He focused as hard as he could on the ring, hoping to put on a good show if nothing else. Hope, anticipation, sadness. All of these emotions were as sharp as knives stabbing Joe in the head, but he had prepared himself for whatever ghosts might show up. Anger, doubt. "What do you feel?" Carl asked. "Love," Joe lied, squeezing his eyes shut. Whoever owned the ring loved someone very much. It was a wedding ring, after all. Carl seemed intrigued, and even Max's annoyance faded slightly as he listened to Joe. The anger of the ghost near Joe rose, but Joe tried his best to hide that emotion from his expression. He took a deep breath, as if to steady himself. "I'm feeling someone nearby," Joe continued. "It's a man, someone young, either when he died or when he got married. It's hard to tell." "What else?" "There is an R sound in his name. First name or last? I'm not sure." Carl was growing excited. Max was letting his guard down. Even the ghost nearby was feeling less anger than he had been before. "Is the spirit saying anything?" Carl asked. "Does he have a message for us?" Joe furrowed his brow, as though he was listening harder than before. He shifted the ring in his hand and shook his head, as though he was having a hard time with this. "Princeton," Joe finally said. "I don't know what it is, but there's something about Princeton. Someone who lives there, or works there maybe." Another ghost entered the room. This was the same ghost who had crept into the basement with Joe the night before. His companion, who could control how close he got to Joe, and how much Joe felt of him. "There's someone else here," Joe allowed, though he was careful not to say too much. He was simply trying to sell the act, not reveal anything that would help his captors, or allow them to realize that he could sense nothing but emotions from those ghosts. "Who is it?" Carl asked. "I don't know. He's different than the others. He stays in the shadows, watches. He's..." Joe allowed his voice to trail off, hoping that Carl or Max would know who he was talking about. Maybe they could shed some light on who this ghost was, but neither of them said a word. Distrust, hate, hopelessness, sadness. Joe felt hollow inside, and if he didn't know any better, he would have thought that these feelings were his own. "He whispers," Joe told Carl. "I don't know who he is, but he is different." Joe opened his eyes and put the ring down on the table. He could still feel the first ghost next to him, the emotion slightly weaker than when he held the ring. This ghost felt like he was desperate for Joe to hear him, but angry and hopeless at the same time. The companion remained small in the room for several seconds after Joe opened his eyes. It was amused by the act. Then it faded into nothingness, leaving Joe alone with only one ghost near him. "I can't get any more," Joe told Carl. "The shadier one is blocking me from reading the man who belongs to the ring." "Princeton," Max whispered to Carl, as though Joe wouldn't hear him. He seemed excited by the word. Carl looked Joe in the eyes, and Joe couldn't tell whether Carl believed a word that he was saying or if he would recognize the lies. Joe could feel the distrust. He could feel the questions swimming around Carl's head, but there was also a bit of intrigue. Not quite on the level that Max was feeling, but he didn't entirely distrust Joe. "I'm tired," Joe told him. "I can't do this when I'm tired. It's too hazy. I'm too weak. I'm telling you, I did the best I could." Carl remained silent. looking into Joe's eyes as though he could read Joe's thoughts and would expose the lies that Joe had told. Joe was afraid to look away. If he shifted his gaze, would it look like he was hiding something? If he continued to stare at Carl, would he appear too desperate for Carl to believe him? He didn't know which option would be more likely to get him killed. Carl reached over to the table and picked up the wedding ring. He held it in his hand, looking at it closely, and then making a fist, clutching it as tightly as Joe had. He paused for a moment, as though he was trying to feel something from the ring, but it was a hopeless cause. Finally, Carl told Joe, "There is another object in this room which belongs to a ghost. I want you to tell me which object it is." Fear, panic, hopelessness, dread, all coming from Joe himself this time. He had no idea how he was going to find the object. The longer he tried to keep up this act, the more likely he was to slip and get someone killed. He nodded to Carl, accepting the challenge and trying not to appear nervous about it. He then stood and looked around the room. There were tables with little figurines on them, lamps, candy dishes. There were shelves with framed photographs and sketches, a hand-stitched sampler hanging over the fireplace. Joe swallowed hard as he started to move across the room, examining different pieces and running his hand over them. He could feel anticipation from everyone around him, and a new ghost coming closer, eager to see where he stopped. "There was a woman who used to live here," Joe told Carl as he examined some knickknacks on the mantel. "She was older, a mother, I think." He was recalling what he'd learned from a helpful neighbor who lived near the Door Bakery back in the city. "The pieces here are all very feminine," Carl told him, distrustful. "This woman died. She left this house to her son," Joe continued, now running his fingers over one of the framed photographs on the wall. He turned to Carl and said, "The son isn't here now. He's dead too, but I don't feel him nearby." From one of the nearby rooms, Joe could feel a sense of sadness, followed by hate. It was Yuta, reacting to Joe's words about her husband. "His wife is here now," Joe told Carl. "Dead?" "In the other room, listening to me." Carl looked toward one of the doorways, which led to the room where Yuta was listening in on the conversation. He had a spark of a smile in his eye as he realized that Joe was telling the truth. The spark faded as Carl looked back to Joe and said, "You haven't found the object?" Max straightened, and his grip on the gun tightened, as though he was waiting for the order to shoot Joe dead. Joe continued to walk around the room, looking at objects as he went, hoping that he would be able to find the right piece, but desperate to stall for time until he did. "I'm not sure the mother likes what you've done with her house," Joe said. He could hear Yuta's footsteps in the other room as she walked away from the door. She was upset, but from what Joe could tell, Yuta was always upset. Joe reached a bookcase and started to run his hand over the books, reading the titles as he went along. If he couldn't sense the object that belonged to the ghost, he was hoping that he would at least be able to use his skills as a book salesman to track it down. There was a copy of Mein Kampf on the shelf, amongst other older literary gems. Joe's eyes locked onto the book, and he smiled, about to jokingly ask how many copies of the same book one group of people could possibly need. But before he could ask, his heart skipped a beat. He was overwhelmed by a sense of hope and eagerness coming from the ghost who had just recently joined him in the room. These emotions were enough to make Joe's smile fade, and he put his hand on the book, pulling it off of the bookcase. He held the book in his hand, studying the face of Adolf Hitler on its cover with a disapproving look in his eyes, as though the photo itself could sense the fact that Joe was putting on an act. Except this wasn't an act. He had actually found the piece that belonged to the ghost. The book was worn from use, and there were burn marks on one corner of its cover, which bled onto some of the book's pages. The burns reminded Joe of the melted spot on the wedding ring. He turned and looked at Carl, tossing him the book as he said, "This is it." Carl caught the book, but his expression did not soften. He kept a distrustful expression in his eyes, even as Max grinned. "You're sure this is it?" Carl asked. "Every soldier is given a copy of this book, every couple on their wedding day. It's a common item, and you believe that this is the one item we have which belongs to one of the other spirits? The spirit is loyal to the cause, Joe answered, this time sure of what he was saying, surprising even himself. Carl put the book down on the table with the spirit board and said, You're correct. So I've helped you. Now I want to see the others. You haven't helped me. You've simply proven that you're capable of helping. I told you what I could. This isn't like watching a movie or reading a book. It's harder than that. So we'll sit here, and we'll work for the rest of the day if we must. We had a deal. You said that you'd let me see Annalise if I cooperated with you, and I have. I never said when you would get to see her. Joe smiled and nodded. He then asked, Is that how you're going to play this game? Because I might stop trusting your word, and if I stop trusting your word, I'll have nothing left to lose, and you'll be left in the same spot you were in before I got here. He could feel a flood of anger building inside of Carl. Though Carl tried to hide the emotion, Joe could see his eyes narrow just slightly and his muscles tense. I thought you were a man of your word, Joe pushed. But you're not a man at all, really. You're just a Nazi coward. Enough, Max yelled, pointing the gun at Joe and looking as though he could pull the trigger at any moment. Joe could feel Max trying to regain control of the situation. He wasn't about to pull the trigger without Carl telling him to do so. Joe didn't flinch. Carl stood and walked toward Joe, still fuming but trying desperately to keep that anger from getting the best of him. When he reached Joe, Carl grabbed him by the collar and pulled him closer. He looked Joe in the eyes and said, You want to see the girl? He threw Joe toward the doorway that would lead him to the bedroom so harshly that Joe nearly fell over. Carl followed him and pushed him toward the bedroom door. As they neared the bedroom, Carl pushed Joe up against the wall and held him there as he unlocked the bedroom door. When the door was opened, he pushed Joe into the bedroom. You have 5 minutes, Carl told Joe, before slamming the door shut. Joe could feel Carl's anger as he walked away from the bedroom, and Max along with him, uncertain and probably trying to calm Carl down. Joe? He finally turned toward her, shutting out the emotions outside of that room and giving his mind a break. Are you all right? He asked her. I'm fine, just catching up on the finer points of German literature, she answered, holding up the copy of The Myth of the 20th Century that they had seen through the window when they first arrived at the house. Of course, I don't speak German, so I'm not getting very far. Joe walked over to the window and opened the curtains. He found that the window had several pieces of scrap wood nailed over it, keeping anyone from escaping. Are you all right, Joe? She asked, going to him and putting a hand on his back. Are you doing what they ask? Yeah. What do they want? They want me to talk to ghosts. They need information that the ghosts have. Did you get it for them? Not as much as they'd like, but it's giving me a chance to feel them out. Maybe I can find a way out of here if I can use their emotions against them. How? Well, Carl likes to pretend that he's calm and collected, but he's not. His temper gets the best of him, and it makes him weak, Joe told her. Yuta is proud. She doesn't like the fact that they need me. She doesn't like the fact that I'm here at all, or you for that matter. And Max? Max is a foolish kid. Joe went to the closet and opened it to see if there was anything inside of it that he could use as a weapon. He found it empty. Turning around, he continued, His weakness is your sister. Just the thought of her causes a reaction in him. What sort of reaction? Love, obsession, and, believe it or not, he loves that baby that they had together. Joe could feel a surge of anger after he mentioned the baby. I can feel his mind wandering toward them, even when he's supposed to be keeping that gun on me. I can see his eyes looking toward the ceiling, like he's listening to see if they're okay. As twisted as it might sound, that boy is truly in love, and that love is his biggest weakness. His love for Leah. She's the only one upstairs, unless I'm mistaken. He can't possibly love her, not after what he's done. Stranger things have happened, he shrugged. Listen, we don't have much time. They're going to come back for me soon. What will you do? Try to keep up the act, I suppose. What else can I do? You can't talk to ghosts, Joe. Then I guess I'll have to keep lying. It's what always worked for Leah, right? At least until people saw her for what she really was and didn't want her around anymore. The door opened. Carl stood in the doorway, now composed and clear-headed. He motioned for Joe to come with him, and Joe did as he was instructed. As Carl closed the door behind them, Joe looked back at her one last time, taking in the pained expression on her face. After the door was closed and locked, Carl turned to Joe and asked him, "Are you ready to get back to work now?" Joe shook his head and told Carl, "The deal was, if I cooperated with you, I'd get to see Annalise. I think we both know now. That's not Annalise."
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.